Video arranged by Emmanuel Isaiah Smith.
Hello, good afternoon. It is your host, Emmanuel Isaiah Smith, and today's date is Monday, January 19th, 2025. The time is 12:30 p.m., and I am in Kendall, Florida. The topic of today's lecture is the Soviet People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, also known as the NKVD, and similarities in operation to gangstalking. Ladies and gentlemen, it is beneficial, and indeed it is necessary and critical to recognize that clandestine gang stalking is, in more ways than one, the brainchild of programs that have already existed. One of these programs, COINTELPRO, I did a lecture on some time ago. You're more than welcome to look at this lecture on YouTube or Facebook, and you'll see where COINTELPRO, which is an FBI program that ran from 1956 to 1971, is in many respects the spiritual progenitor of clandestine gang stalking. But there are other programs, you see. Gang stalking is a conglomerate of covert, hidden, and clandestine governmental forces that have a hidden agenda that society, particularly American society, has not been made aware of before the program was implemented. You see, there are a number of programs that resemble gang stalking. You have COINTELPRO, you have the NKVD, you have the Schutzstaffel, you have Project MK Ultra, which we'll talk about in future lectures. There are so many programs, many of which we'll explore today, that resemble gang stalking in function, in operation, in cause, you see. But the difference is this. Typically, when a secret police organization is implemented, and keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, we're not talking about law enforcers. Okay, when you talk about the secret police, okay? If you look at the Third Reich, it's secret police. If you look at the Schutzstaffel, it's secret police. The Gestapo, the NKVD, okay? Various programs that have existed across the decades, across the generations, that utilize secret police. The secret police is simply their name. They are secret police in name only. Their job is not to investigate emergencies or make reports or do citations or make arrests. Okay? When you talk secret police, okay, you're talking about a governmental auxiliary, okay, a conglomerate, okay, a nationwide force in and of itself that has a duty, a cause, an agenda, okay, a mission to carry out clandestine operations that may or may not have an ethical application. Okay, when you talk about Hitler's Gestapo, when you talk about Stalin's NKVD, when you talk about the FBI's COINTELPRO, when you talk about MK Ultra, all of these programs, and we'll talk about Benito Mussolini's OVRA in future lectures as well. Okay, when you talk about secret police, okay, You're not talking about something that is easily observable, as for example, a plainclothes police officer. Okay, it's not something that's easily observable. Like, for example, if you were to go to a military base, or if you were to tour a military city, or if you were to tour a military compound, you're going to see military personnel in their gear. They'll have their utility items. Some of them may even have firearms on them. You can look at them and easily identify them as military personnel. It's the same with most police. Well, we'll not say most police, we'll say what they call uniform police officers. You see them, you identify them by the squad car, by the badge, by the uniform, by a number of things. But when you talk about secret police, you're talking about people who have a mission of secrecy. Okay, they're not supposed to be so obvious as to what their mission is, as to what their cause or agenda is, you see? And the reason that you're not supposed to know is because not all secret operative missions are totally ethical in their application. Okay, and you'll see what we mean as we get into the NKVD here. And because of that potential lack of ethical application to the clandestine mission, so as not to upset the sensibilities of common people, of everyday people, these things have to be kept quietly, but they're kept quietly not because the mission is unimportant to the overall objectives of the government that sent them. They could be equally as important or even more important than anything you've ever imagined. It's just they simply don't want the general public to know. This is why we're being so secretive about this. This is why we're being so hidden. This is why these are clandestine operations. You see, that's something that is left to speculation on purpose. Okay? Because these clandestine operations are of some benefit to public and private actors in various capacities. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, we will get into the Soviet NKVD, also known as the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs. It is a in the Soviet Union, okay, which was essentially a war zone for much of its existence. And it was a war zone by design. Okay, the advent of Soviet Russia, okay, was birthed from the assassination of Tsar Nicholas II, who was the last emperor of Russia. Okay, he was of the Romanov family, who had ruled Russia for generations and generations. Hundreds of years this family ruled over Russia. And by most historians' accounts, this Romanov family, particularly Tsar Nicholas II, ruled Russia very incompetently. Okay? And it was particularly militarily. Okay, there was military incompetence under the czars of Russia. Okay? As a matter of fact, if you look at the Russo-Japanese War, okay, by 1905, the Japanese had totally subdued Russia. I mean, the Japanese obliterated the Russian military in that war, not because the Russian military was incompetent. Russia has always had some of the most powerful militaries in the world, even to the present day. But under Tsar Nicholas, the military was very incompetently run and by incompetently operated, but in contrast to that, the Imperial Japanese Army was very competently run at the turn of the 20th century. And that conflict ended in a decisive victory for the Japanese and a decisive loss for the Russians. And when the Russo-Japanese War ended, and Japan had emerged as the victor, Russian people, from peasants all the way up to the monarchy, were scratching their heads like, well, how on earth did we lose 1 million soldiers? How is that even possible? You see. So there was that. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the coming forth of the Bolsheviks. Okay? In order to understand why the NKVD existed, this secret service, this secret espionage service, this secret disruption service, this secret assassination service, this secret data collection service. In order to understand why it existed and how it existed, you must understand the coming forth or the advent of the Bolsheviks. The Bolshevik Revolution under Vladimir Lenin. You must understand these things, you see, because the monarchy in Russia had grown old to the Russian people, okay? They were not a monarchy that was considered a standard of human excellence. Like, for example, in today's monarchies, you have the monarchies of England, you have the monarchies of Spain, you have the monarchies of Sweden, you have the monarchies of Thailand, and you have the monarchies of, for example, Saudi Arabia and other countries throughout the world that have monarchies even to the present day. Now, some of these monarchies are symbolic in nature, and some of these monarchies are political in nature, and some of these monarchies have largely symbolic powers, but mostly, I guess you could say, marginal political powers. But the monarchs are considered heads of state nonetheless, despite the actual level of political power that they wield, as opposed to, for example, a president of a country or a prime minister of a country. For example, in the United Kingdom, you have the monarchy of England, which is presently overseen by His Highness King Charles III, who was coronated just within the past 24 months. And he is considered the head of state of the United Kingdom. However, the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, is the one who is considered the de facto, or rather the de jure, head of state with respect to his roles, duties, and responsibilities as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And then, for example, over in you have in Saudi Arabia, you have a monarch that has the honorific title His Excellency. And underneath him, you have parliamentary considerations. And you also have a head of state like a premier or a prime minister, similar to England, but the king is still the head of state. When you look at the monarchies of today's world, not only in the countries that I just mentioned, but if you look at the monarchies around the world that have endured over the centuries, the people of those countries sustain their monarchies as symbols of human excellence, as symbols of the excellence of the population of those countries, as symbols of the excellence of the government of those countries, indeed the innate nobility that all of the citizens of that country have residing in them. That innate nobility is manifested in their monarchies. And the people sustain those monarchies with their tax dollars and with the homage, okay, and the cultural appreciation that they have for their respective monarchies. That's a reason why these monarchies have endured through the ages, even in a world where the power, the absolute power, or the total power of monarchs is shared with a premier and or a legislature. But here, okay, Tsar Nicholas II, the emperor of all of Russia, all 8.8 square million miles of Russia, he ruled it as a king would a kingdom, with an iron fist. Okay? There was a time where the economy in Russia was horrible. The military was not run properly. And there was a peasant revolt. Okay? Tsar Nicholas sent his army to quell the revolt, and that army killed 1,000 peasants for protesting the terrible state of Russian society at that time. Okay, it's called Bloody Sunday. And it came right on the heels of a military defeat by the Japanese Imperial Army in the Russo-Japanese War. So you had all of these things compounded on top of each other. And the monarch seemed very uninvolved and very uninterested in what was happening. In so much as he threw a dinner ball that very same day. 1,000 souls deceased, and the monarch went to a dinner ball that night. Okay? The people simply grew tired of monarchy in Russia because that monarchy ceased to represent itself as a manifestation of the innate excellence of its people. So eventually the people started organizing themselves in a plot to overthrow the monarchy. Russian people, Russian voters, Russian politicians, Russian lawyers, they all started scratching their heads and said, how did we let our monarchy become so incompetent? It's time for a revolution. It's time for a different kind of government. The Romanovs have had their time. We want a government that is more beholden to the people, you see. So ultimately you had people like Vladimir Lenin, for example, a man who himself was very bitter at the monarchy of Russia. And the reason Vladimir Lenin was bitter at the monarchy of Russia is because his older brother, at one point in his life, joined a terrorist group in Russia. And this terrorist group was hell-bent on assassinating the Emperor of Russia, you see. And what happened was this terrorist plot was foiled. It was found out and it was foiled by the Russian authorities. Now, Vladimir Lenin's older brother, in this plot, this terrorist plot, his job was to make an explosive device so that they could blow the king up in a commemoration. event that he was having. But that plot was discovered by the Russian authorities and thwarted. And Vladimir Lenin's older brother was found out as the maker of this explosive device, and his brother was duly and rightfully hanged. You see, there are some persons who investigate Roman or Russian history that agree with that decision, and there are those like myself that disagree with that decision. Okay? Ultimately, if you have a problem with, well, we're talking back in the late 1800s, early 1900s right now. Typically, it would make more sense in my estimation as a political commentator and as a historian to solve these kinds of problems diplomatically. Okay? If you're using terroristic means to try and instigate political change, what sense does that make? Who is that going to persuade that you or your political foresight is the foresight of the future? If you have to blow up a head of state or blow up politicians or blow up military bases or blow up buildings or headquarters to make a political statement, the average person, that offends their sensibility. Okay, no one's going to be rooting for the guy that does that. Okay, no one rooted for Timothy McVeigh when he blew up the Oklahoma City federal building. No one rooted for any of the various other domestic terrorist attacks that we've seen on American soil. No one's ever rooted for the guy that says, you know what? I'm gonna perch myself on top of a building, pull out a rifle, and try to assassinate a head of state. Okay, no one's rooting for that guy. No one's saying, okay, you know what? That act was so awesome and unbelievable that, you know what? Whatever that guy's political views are, I want those political views myself. No one's rooting for that guy. Okay? Typically, people see people like that as fanatics and zealots. And I think personally that acts of terrorism are an inefficient way of instigating political change. However, Vladimir Lenin, okay, the future head of state of Soviet Russia, while he was a young man, okay, contemplating going into the legal profession, his brother, his older brother, who was in his 20s, if I'm not mistaken, hatched a plot to do just that. In the life of the reigning monarch of Russia using terroristic means, he was caught and he was hanged. Okay? This event had a dramatic effect on Vladimir Lenin's thinking with respect to how he viewed monarchies. Yes, this young man's older brother was found out and exposed as an actor in a terroristic plot and was caught, and he was executed by the state. But still, it gave young Lenin a dramatic disdain for monarchies. And that disdain for monarchies that Lenin had, particularly because his brother was executed by a monarchy, was a driving force in this young man's political beliefs and his desire to bring about the end of the monarchy politically, you see. Now, ultimately, and we'll skip forward a little bit, about 12 years later, all right, Vladimir Lenin had reached a plateau of power. He'd rubbed shoulders with a lot of powerful people since his brother was executed. He'd been to jail numerous times at the behest of the monarchy. Once or twice in Siberia, actually. And he was actually a favorite subject of the monarchy's own secret police force. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, the czars of Russia, the emperors of Russia, they're known as the czars, had their own secret police force that was the forerunner of the NKVD. There were several. You had the secret prikaz, or the Tiny prikaz, which ran from 1654 to 76. You had the Preobrazhensky prikaz, which went from 1686 to 1726. You had the secret chancellery, which ran from 1731 to 1762. You had the secret expedition, which ran from 1762 to 1801. And you had the third section of His Imperial Majesty's own chancellery, which ran from 1826 to 1880. And after those, you had the, it's called the Okhrana, which was also a secret police force that essentially had a lot of the same espionage, assassination, and covert warfare components as the various other secret police forces that I've just named. But you see, the czars of Russia had their own secret police forces. Secret police forces, or covert operations forces, existed long before Hitler. They existed long before Stalin. They existed long before the COINTELPRO products of the 1950s through the 70s. Okay, secret police operations go back as far as the 1600s. And those secret, covert, and clandestine mechanisms were passed down from generation to generation, from secret police force to secret police force. And one thing you'll notice about these secret police forces throughout history is that they run for a set and specified period of time. They don't run indefinitely. Okay, for example, the Schutzstaffel, it ran for 13 years. All right, the various forerunners to the Okhrana, which itself was a forerunner to the NKVD, they all ran for about a similar period of time. For example, the secret prikaz, it ran for 12 years. The Preobrazhensky prikaz, that ran for a while. That ran for 40 years. Then the next one, the secret chancellery, that ran for 31 years. The secret expedition ran for 39 years. And then the third section of His Imperial Majesty's own chancellery, that ran for 54 years. So what you'll notice is this: these secret police forces, these covert operations forces, typically through history, you'll see that they run for a specified period of time, then they disband. And then, if necessary, a new covert operations unit is created, and then it runs for a specific period of time, then it disbands. Then another secret organization that handles covert operations is created. It runs for a specific period of time, then it disbands. You see, that's to keep people, that's so that they can evolve their tactics, so they can leave, regroup, learn from what happened, and come back. and so that the people don't get wise to it, because apparently secret organizations and secret operative organizations and so forth are seen as assets to some governments more so than others. And part of keeping those auxiliaries safe is to keeping them under wraps. I mean, COINTELPRO, I mean, the FBI program that was the disrupting force of the Ku Klux Klan, the Black Panther Party, the American Communist Party, and so many left-wing and right-wing activist groups in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that program followed suit. It ran for 15 years, then it disbanded. You see, just like the covert operators, the covert intelligence operators in Europe 300, 400 years ago. You see, it's almost as if it's a secret society of some kind, as if it's a secret protocol that these hidden officers or these hidden operative units follow. Okay, down through the ages, 300, 400 years. Okay, not only in Europe, not only in Asia, not only in the Middle East, not only in Africa, but also in the United States. You see that pattern. These secret operative units are created to do a mission, to gather data, to perform various duties that are secret in nature. And these operations last anywhere from 15 to 30 years. Then the undercover unit disbands, or the operation disbands, and it's done with, and then a new operative unit is created in the future if need be. And I would like to present to you, ladies and gentlemen, as we move forward with this lecture, that gang stalking is no different. Gang stalking has been operating in heightened levels since, in my estimation, probably 2013. So I've always asserted that I've been in a clandestine gang stalking campaign for 30 years. However, I've seen it in heightened levels over the past 13. You see? Now, 13 years is, for example, with the example of COINTELPRO, right? That lasted for 15 years. I'm in the 13th year of a gang stalking campaign that has been operating in heightened levels. You see? And because I've gone on to expose it, the only sensible thing for the national security apparatus in this country to do is disband. Okay? Once these programs have operated for this long, and it even gets to the point where persons like myself can look around, take pictures of what I see, take videos of what I see, document what I see, and not only explain them to people, but draw parallels between this program and programs that have existed in the past in other countries, okay? That's how you know that the program has been sniffed out. It's been found out. It's been exposed. And the only wise thing for the operatives of the program to do at this point is to disband. Okay, because this program has the capacity to damage the image of the United States, and damage America's image it will do if responsible measures are not taken. So let's get back to the subject matter at hand, ladies and gentlemen. So Vladimir Lenin at some point was able to organize himself into a political party, and this political party was able to get financing with him as the head, and ultimately this political party was able to put together the resources and the manpower to usurp the government of the Russian Empire from its monarch. And this monarchy was eventually assassinated by these new, energetic, well-resourced, and very zealous Bolsheviks, which were headed up by Vladimir Lenin. Now, after Vladimir Lenin passed, okay, his life, his political philosophy, which was called Leninism, which is basically derivative of Marxism, which is essentially the brainchild of Karl Marx, the political theorist. All right, Leninism is derived from Marxism and is the foundation of modern communism. Okay, a government established on these communist principles, okay, which originated in Karl Marx's book Das Kapital, which Vladimir Lenin studied that book intensively and derived his own political philosophy from that book. And his political philosophy was one that his successor, Joseph Stalin, adhered to. You see, he wanted to rule Russia with an iron fist. Okay? Stalin had seen people very close to him get assassinated. And Stalin was a guy that he loved power. He loved power. He loved power so much that he was willing to sacrifice his entire country, if need be, to keep that power. I mean, his NKVD assassinated or executed, rather, 1.2 million Russians, some of which hadn't done anything at all to anybody. The man was just a bloodthirsty, mad, tyrannical dictator, and he essentially, under the banner of Marxist-Leninism, slew so many people. I mean, the numbers, by the time Joseph Stalin passed away, they say that the number of people that he caused the death of was anywhere from 12 million to 24 million people, most of which were Russian peasants. How did he keep his people in line? Two ways. The NKVD, which was his secret police, and the gulag camps that he kept. And these gulag camps were numerous. I mean, I believe he had more than 50 gulags throughout Russia. And his secret police's job was to find ways to essentially arrest anyone who showed any anti-government sentiment at all. And that's even, I mean, NKVD operatives were everywhere. I mean, Stalin's government had NKVD operatives in every church. Well, actually, churches were abolished, actually. There really were no churches in the early Soviet Russia, but we'll move on. They had them in every school. They had them in every college. They had NKVD operatives in every university. They had them in every courtroom. They had them in every neighborhood. Okay, they had them in every business establishment. They had them in every barber shop. They had them in every hair salon. They had them in every gymnasium. All right, they had them at every sporting event. They had them in every pub or diner. They had NKVD operatives in every in every shopping plaza. I mean, the economy of Russia wasn't terribly great during those days. There wasn't a lot of shopping going on, but anywhere that a person could go for leisure, including public parks or libraries or anything of the sort, Stalin's government had NKVD agents in all of those places. Okay, and not just in Russia. Keep in mind, this is the Soviet Union. Okay, it's not just Russia, it's the Soviet Union. There are a lot of countries that were under the power of this man. Okay, it wasn't just Russia, it was Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltics, Central Asia, Poland, Eastern Europe, and parts of Asia that were subject to Stalin's whims, his power, his purges, his suppression, his oppression. Okay? One second, ladies and gentlemen. All right, there were occupied territories in Poland, the Baltic states, which include Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. There was Ukraine and Bessarabia. There was Germany. You know, the Soviets had influence all over Europe, and the NKVD was essentially a place, a semi-military to military unit that was not under the jurisdiction of any court, any constitution, or any rules. It operated under its own banner, and its only job was to imprison dissidents or anyone, really. They didn't even have to be an enemy of the state. They didn't have to be a subversive. They didn't have to be a resistance fighter. Anyone that the Politburo, which was the overarching, I guess you could call it the federal government of the Soviet Union. Any organization or any person or organization that the Politburo ordered the NKVD to arrest, prosecute, or do executions with, it was carried out without a question. You see? I suppose Stalin in particular, his thinking was, because Russia is so vast and because we have so many other countries that we have power over, we must be ruthless, we must rule with an iron fist, otherwise there will be uprisings and our government could be toppled. That is the only way to quantify or qualify why there were so many imprisonments and executions. And mind you, these gulags that people were thrown in, a lot of the people, millions of people who were arrested and thrown in these gulags for being, quote, enemies of the state. And these gulags were, they were poorly kept. They were horribly situated in areas where there was maximum cold during the winters, and people were worked to death in these gulag camps simply out of suspicion. You didn't have to be in commission of a crime. You didn't have to be a political dissident. You could just simply be a political dissident's neighbor, and you could be thrown into one of these gulags, and you would be worked to death, man, woman, or child, or well, men and women mostly. Children were kept in them, but they were obviously not worked to death. But it was a very ruthless system, and it was one that allowed the overarching federal structure of Soviet Russia to operate with impunity, okay? That is in itself reminiscent of clandestine gangstalking, okay? The NKVD operated without rules. They operated without rules. Just like gangstalkers operate without rules, okay? They are allowed to punish, pester, harm, attack any person particularly target individuals with no recourse whatsoever. With no recourse whatsoever. Okay? And you'll read at some point in history when the NKVD was disbanded and replaced with another secret operative force, not a single NKVD officer was prosecuted for crimes against humanity, which is a stark contrast to Adolf Hitler's officers who were prosecuted to the full extent of the law in the Nuremberg trials. Many of them were hanged. But NKVD officers, not a single one was prosecuted, ever. They were very protected in the various harms that they did to the Russian society, with execution, with mass arrests, with kidnappings, with torture to extract fake confessions from these people. No one in the NKVD was ever prosecuted or jailed or executed for what they did at the direction of Joseph Stalin or his cabinet members or the direct supervisors of NKVD officers. None of them were prosecuted. That's how gang stalking is set up, ladies and gentlemen. It's set up in such a way so as to make it difficult or impossible to prosecute a gang stalker. So, for example, if a gang stalker is signaled to harm somebody, let's say a gang stalker is signaled to run somebody over with their vehicle, and they do it. If that person is caught, they could be charged and convicted with vehicular manslaughter or worse, but they can't be prosecuted for gang stalking, which is what they are participating in. Okay? If a stalker is signaled to someone to harm that person, it could be workplace sabotage, it could be burglaries to that person's home or vehicle, it could be assault, it could be worse. If that person escapes, they may or may not be caught by law enforcement for what they did. But if they're caught by law enforcement, they'll be prosecuted for the exact crime that they committed. They wouldn't be prosecuted necessarily for gang stalking, which is the signaling mechanism that they responded to commit the crime against a person. You see, I'm not sure we have a gang stalking legal definition in the United States Criminal Code right now. I believe they should. But we don't have gang stalking as a identifiable crime that someone could be prosecuted for, cited for, jailed for, or executed for. Okay? I've long held for at least 10 years now that there are persons who have lost their very lives to this activity, and no one was ever prosecuted for gang stalking. They might have been prosecuted for something else if caught, but not for the specific crime of gang stalking and its signaling mechanism. You see, the NKVD is a glowing and shining example of this parallel. Persons committing horrible atrocities against their fellow man in a covert or clandestine fashion at the behest of a governmental auxiliary or mechanism that were never caught or prosecuted for their crime. Okay? That was a hallmark of the NKVD. None of its participants were ever prosecuted. Okay? It looks like they're trying to do something similar here in the United States with gang stalking. They want to make it impossible or nearly impossible to prosecute for the crime of gang stalking in and of itself. You see, that is very reminiscent of the NKVD and its protocols in the Soviet Union. I'm going to read from a document that I have here. And for one second here, I'm going to bring up the title of this document. And this lecture will go over the 1 hour mark, ladies and gentlemen. This document is called the Handbook on USSR Military Forces, Chapter 4, Semi-Military Organizations. This document was written on the 15th of March, 1946, and it is kept at the Digital Commons at the University of Nebraska. And it basically goes to show how the prosecutor's office was restricted from prosecuting members of the NKVD for any reason. It says the prosecutor's office was completely removed from the investigation, being the interrogations of prisoners, which were conducted without a prosecutor's presence. It was run entirely by the NKVD staff, which led to a catastrophic increase in the number of crimes. Talakadze, who was during Troika's sessions, especially when the case concerned his colleagues and acquaintances, sometimes tried to look into the files of the accused, confirmed that he had discovered violations in the investigation of a number of cases and inconsistencies of the report with the content of the case, mainly in the part of the confessions of the accused. So, what this shows us is that the NKVD, under the Stalin regime, oftentimes it would seize people who were labeled as enemies of the state, and that's regardless of if they had done anything wrong or not. Okay, you didn't necessarily have to be an enemy of the state to find yourself having been prosecuted, or rather harmed or otherwise interrogated by the NKVD. All that needed to happen, or all that needed to be gathered, was reasonable suspicion. And sometimes reasonable suspicion was not even necessary. Okay? You did not have to be a criminal. You could be the relative of somebody who had political dissident views. And you could be taken by the NKVD and tortured into a confession that you were a part of some plot to undermine Stalin's government. You didn't have to be a part of a plot, but they could get false confessions from you using the torture mechanism. And this torture mechanism would result in a false confession from you that you were a part of something that you were not actually a part of. Okay, subversive activity, seditionist activity, activity to overthrow the government, activity to overthrow Stalin, activity to assassinate Stalin or any of his officers. You could be coerced into a false confession by the NKVD, who was judge, jury, and executioner. You see, all of the NKVD's activity was extrajudicial, meaning that if you were questioned by the NKVD, this was done outside of the legal mandates of a court of law. There was no habeas corpus. There was no formal writ of a charge against you. There was no defense attorney. There was no prosecutor present. There was no judge. There was no jury. And there was no sentencing. Okay? If you were under suspicion of being anti-government or subversive or a seditionist or anything of the sort, okay, Stalin himself, his cabinet, his officers or regional authorities would issue mandates for your arrest. And not just your arrest, the arrest of your family members, the arrest of some of your neighbors, the arrest of some of your coworkers or colleagues that you may have talked to. All of you were going to gulags to be worked to death. Whether or not you had done something, all it took was reasonable suspicion that you were up to something. And the NKVD, under the direction of the Politburo, never documented denials of the facts. So if you were taken out of your home one night, let's say you were eating dinner with your family, and then the NKVD was notorious for this now. Okay, they liked to go and arrest people at dinner time. That was one of their protocols. That was one of their procedures. They liked to arrest people at dinner time. Okay, they liked to go to your house around dinner time when you were sitting in your living room or in your dining room with your family eating dinner. That was their favorite time to arrest you because it added drama, it added shock, it added terror to the arrest. And a lot of families who maybe the man of the house was arrested at dinner time for suspicion of subversion or suspicion of anti-government activities, he was taken to a gulag and his family would never see him again. You see. And these things were perpetrated out of a sense of sustenance. Okay? Stalin wasn't going anywhere. He wanted to rule Russia with an iron fist that was beyond anything the emperors of Russia, the former emperors of Russia, had ever tried themselves. You see. And Stalin did away with not only political dissidents that were suspected of something, he did away with a lot of his own officers. Okay? If you look at a list of Stalin's officers, his acquaintances, his fellow politicians, if you look at their lives, a lot of them were executed by Stalin himself through various mandates that he would sign into law, simply because he suspected them of not being 100% loyal to him. All he had to do was suspect that you weren't loyal. It didn't matter if you were or not. If he suspected you weren't loyal, he would have you arrested and executed. No one was safe. All right, as far as I'm concerned, at least 2 of Stalin's top NKVD officials were executed by Stalin personally because he thought that they were disloyal. Okay? Even the officers that carried out massive arrests and executions to the tune of anywhere from 700,000 people to 1.2 million Russians killed out of suspicion of anti-government activity. The officers, the head officers that oversaw those mass arrests and those mass executions were themselves executed by Stalin at some point in their career. Okay? There was no way to really prove to Joseph Stalin that you were 110% loyal. There was simply no way to prove it. Okay? If he was suspicious of you, that's all that you needed to be executed, was his suspicion. Okay? That is not unlike gang stalking at all, ladies and gentlemen. Gang stalking operates in the exact same way. You could be under suspicion of having done something wrong or said something wrong or an act of aggression or anything of the sort. you'd be punished. Okay, a stalker would be signaled to try and run you over with a car. Okay, a stalker would be signaled to your exact location to try and contaminate your air and get you sick. A stalker could receive directions to attack you in a hospital, or at work, or at church, or in your own home. All you have to do is having been under suspicion of having offended another gang stalker. See, these gang stalkers, they stick together. Operatives under the liaisons, the operatives, and the gang stalkers themselves, they work in tandem. They work synchronously. They work as a unit, a decentralized unit that operates under a code of secrecy, silence, clandestine operations, timing, mobbing, and power. You don't have to be a person that's plotting a terroristic attack. Okay? You could just simply be a nice person who made the wrong enemy at some point in your life, was thrown into a gang stalking campaign, and now you're in a gang stalking campaign indeed. And you are going to be subject to all the harassments, all the punishments, all the attacks, all of the various oddities and discomforts that any targeted individual faces. And that includes workplace mobbing. The NKVD was notorious for disrupting people at work. Disrupting people at their jobs is a very, very powerful manifestation of clandestine or covert operations. If you can sabotage a person at their job, where they make their livelihood, even in such a way so as to cause them to either lose their job or be fired from their job, and now they got trouble finding a new job because of what happened at their old job, you can very easily control a person's trajectory through this world. If you can control their workplace situation, or their employment situation, or their future earning potential, because mind you, your earning potential goes down drastically if you're fired from a job. Some companies won't even hire a person who's experienced a termination. So if you're a clandestine gang stalker and you got it in for somebody and you're able to tap into the gang stalking mechanism and ruin that person's workplace experience to a catastrophic degree, you can ensure that that person's future earning potential goes down, which allows you to take credit for having degraded the quality of that person's life. All through a system of signals, verbal commands, symbols, cues, vehicular maneuvers, anything to point out the target to other stalkers. And coworkers use this situation, these various symbols as well. Okay, colleagues at your job that may be plugged into gang stalking, they use these symbols as well when they're trying to sabotage one of their fellow employees to reduce competition in the workplace. Okay, and a lot of the action is coming from outside sources. All right, you make the wrong enemy, they want to get revenge on you. They have access to the clandestine gang stalking mechanism. They target you at work. All they got to do is recruit a few of your fellow employees, the ones that don't like you. You see? And what can you do? None of your co-workers, particularly the ones that are conspiring to harm you at work, are going to say, yeah, we did it. These are the signals we use. No, they're going to rejoice. They'll probably, after you leave the company, they'll probably all go out to a local diner, have a few beers and a steak, talk about how glad they are that you're gone, and talk about what a jerk you were at the company that they worked at. And then they'll go back to the job the next day, and now there's less competition in the workplace. They work together as a team to reduce competition in the workplace by getting you either kicked out of the company, forced to resign, or perhaps you just had enough and decided to quit the company. If you're lucky, you get to resign. If you're unlucky, the workplace mobbing mechanism will result in your termination, which could harm your future earning potential. And that's part of gangstalking. If you can hurt a targeted individual's work or future earning potential, you increase their independence on other people or on the government for their day-to-day sustenance. Then you can take easier advantage of them because they can't find ways to escape or combat the various perils that are caused to them by gang stalking and its participants due to lack of personal resources, you see. All right, so and it ties right into this matter we're talking about here. Gang stalking is extrajudicial in nature. Your stalkers are judge, jury, and executioner. That's what makes this program unconstitutional. It's the same thing with the NKVD. It was set up by design that the NKVD were judge, jury, and executioner. All they needed was a mandate from a supervisor or a government official to round up this many people in this part of Russia for these alleged crimes. You're taking them to these gulags, and these are the assignments that they're going to have in those gulags, and you're going to work them in those gulags until they perish. Those were the lengths that Stalin went to ensure that no one would ever take his seat as the chief of Russia. And that's the only thing he was. He was the chief of Russia, you see. And his political, his ideological opponents were executed as well. His chief ideological opponent was a man by the name of Leon Trotsky, who was a man who, like Vladimir Lenin, who was Vladimir Lenin being Stalin's ideological influence. All right. Trotsky, like Lenin, was a disciple of Karl Marx's communism ideology. But Leon Trotsky looked at communism a little differently than Vladimir Lenin, you see. He looked at it a little bit differently than Joseph Stalin. See, Joseph Stalin wanted communism throughout Russia. Leon Trotsky thought that communism and its ideals should be spread about the whole entire world, which in my opinion is a grand idea. You can't force the entire world to embrace the communist ideology. I think in today's world, communism works beautifully in certain countries. But if you try to force communism on people in other countries who may not agree with the ideology, maybe they agree with free market capitalism instead, I mean, how are you going to do that? How are you going to impose your beliefs on another person? It would be as if America tried to impose the free market capitalist ideology on Russia, on China, on North Korea, on Iran, on Vietnam. It would be very difficult, you see, because communism has worked in these countries, you see. So when you take a country like the United States or maybe some of its Western European allies that are free market capitalists, you try to impose communism on them, it could create conditions that would cause a war. And likewise, if a capitalist country, a free market capitalist country, tried to impose capitalism on a communist country, it could create conditions for a war, because not everyone agrees with communism, you see. Even if it works in some countries, some people just simply may not like where it comes from. Some people associate communism with the Soviet Union. Some people associate communism with the horrors that Joseph Stalin unleashed upon the Russian people. You see, there are Americans that think of communism as an evil empire and want nothing to do with it simply because it's communism. And then there are still others that say, well, you know, communism has evolved over the last 80 years. There are no longer massive numbers of people being rounded up and thrown into gulag camps to work until they pass away in freezing weather. That's no longer what this is. It's an economic philosophy concerning the government's control over the means of production in a given country. But still there will be those who disagree with it. So to try to impose that on the whole world, I think Trotsky's views were flawed in that respect. I know he wanted to do it likely diplomatically. Trotsky was a man who had a diplomatic mindset, of course. But Stalin wanted communism in Russia. Stalin wanted Soviet ideals in Russia. Stalin wanted his political philosophies to operate in Russia and its occupied territories, whereas Trotsky wanted to spread it throughout the whole world. They had a difference of opinion here. And at some point, Stalin marked Trotsky for execution. And Trotsky moved to Mexico City. And he lived in Mexico City for a while. And while in Mexico City, Mexico, Trotsky started publishing pamphlets and books about Joseph Stalin, calling him a butcher of the people, and saying that he was a mad tyrant who was misapplying the communist political philosophy. And even in Mexico City, Mexico, these words somehow made it to Stalin's office. And he knew that his old enemy, Leon Trotsky, was in Mexico City, Mexico, publishing negative things about him. So what did Stalin do? He sent covert, plainclothes, NKVD agents thousands of miles away to find Trotsky and executed him, and that's exactly what they did. NKVD agents traveled from Russia to Mexico City and executed Trotsky right in his kitchen. And that was the end of Joseph Stalin's chief political opponent. And what did Stalin do after that? He continued his campaign of organized terror. As a matter of fact, there are parts of Trotsky's reign, particularly in the parts of Stalin's reign, particularly in the 1937 to 38 time frame, that were called the Great Terror or the Great Purge. He just simply commissioned his NKVD to go from place to place, rounding up anyone he was suspicious of and either executing them on the spot, putting them through show trials, or putting them in gulag camps and working them until they passed away. All right? These matters culminated in the Katyn Forest Massacre, which saw the NKVD take Polish officers that Stalin himself was suspicious of and executed 12,000 of them in a forest. And then Stalin, rather than owning up to it, blamed the massacre on the Nazis, who had nothing to do with this massacre. but he blamed it on the Nazis as a pretext to keep the Nazis as his enemy. You see. And we know what happened between the Nazis and Stalin. Hitler invaded Russia at some point, trying to conquer Russia, just like Hitler tried to conquer every European country. And at some point, Hitler's soldiers were at a very steep disadvantage because they had never experienced Russian winters before, and they were ill prepared. Russian soldiers, however, were very prepared, and they were able to obliterate the Nazi German soldiers on the Eastern Front because they knew how to navigate Russian winters a lot better and a lot easier and a lot more effectively than German soldiers were able to navigate Russian winters. So the Russians took advantage of the cold and the wintry conditions that they were used to disadvantage the Nazis, who were, for all intents and purposes, freezing to death as they encountered tank fire, mortar fires, and machine gun fires from a very well-prepared Soviet army. So let's continue on with the NKVD here. 1 second, ladies and gentlemen. So let's go ahead and pull from, let's look at the organizational structure of the NKVD. Okay, the NKVD was a very organized unit. They existed across Russia. They were formed in 1934 and lasted until 1946. So we see that trend again, where this secret covert operations unit operated for a period of time, in this respect for 12 years, and then disbanded after having carried out various covert operations on behalf of the USSR. And they were a very organized and very well-structured unit. You had the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, which had a security force that consisted of the main administration of border troops, the main administration of security troops. Now, this document I'm reading from is from the Digital Commons, unl.edu. There's the main administration of the interior troops, the main administration of signal troops. They have the NKVD Air Brigade. They have the administration of operations troops, the administration of railroad troops, the administration of convoy troops, the main administration of the police force, the main administration of fire defense troops, the main administration for administration, the main administration of NKVD schools, the main administration of the board and motor transport, the main administration of labor camps, the main administration of prisoner of war camps, the NKVD in essentially occupied countries, which basically had a lot of the same components, but they were operating in other countries. See, the NKVD didn't just operate in Russia. It operated throughout the USSR, including the occupied territories. So this vast conglomerate of undercover operatives that were state-sanctioned and very highly trained in espionage were all over Eastern Europe, you see. The NKVD drew influences from the Cheka, which is called the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission. Now, this organization, the Cheka, It ran for 5 years, from December of 1917 to February of 1922. And it was a secret police intelligence agency that operated at the direction of Vladimir Lenin, who is essentially the first head of state of the Soviet Union. And the Cheka performed mass arrest, imprisonments, tortures, and execution without trial. It policed some of the first gulag system of labor camps, conducted requisitions of food, and put down rebellions by workers and peasants. The Cheka was responsible for executing anywhere from 50,000 to 200,000 people, not necessarily because they'd done anything worthy of execution, but because they were under suspicion of having done something worthy of execution. And that's where Joseph Stalin drew a lot of his political philosophy from, with respect to how he instructed the NKVD to operate. We are not going to just arrest, imprison, or execute persons who have committed crimes. We are going to do this to people who are suspected of committing crimes. And as I oftentimes say, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to very, very directly tie in to how the gang stalking mechanism here in the United States operates, okay? You don't have to have been caught in any act of subversion to become a targeted individual. You see, liaisons, operatives, stalkers, they don't like evidence, they like narratives, okay? You don't have to have been anything that resembles a political dissident or disruptive to find yourself in a gang stalking campaign, just like Stalin did back in the USSR. Stalin would punish you for suspicion, and suspicion alone, of having committed some act or crime against the state. Gang stalking is just like that. Just like that. I, your host, have never been caught in any act of sedition or subversion or anti-government activity. Yeah, I'm critical of the government. I'm critical of it because I've been in a gang stalking campaign for 30 years. I've been in a gang stalking campaign that's seen heightened levels of the practice over the past 10 years. I'm critical of the government, but I invoke my First Amendment right to the U.S. Constitution to be critical of my government. As a man, I have to stand up for my rights if all else is lost. I prefer to stand up for my rights as a citizen whose rights are being respected. That way there's an even playing field. But when you're a targeted individual, ladies and gentlemen, your rights, liberties, and constitutional privileges are suspended extrajudicially. And you are completely under the power of the forces that direct your trajectory through this world. It doesn't have to be a church. A church can be a spy. Of course, a church can be a spy. There are a lot of churches that do espionage activity, not only in America, but in other countries. I've always found it interesting that whether you're a capitalist or a communist country, typically there are religious influences there that have some political power. I'm not here to say that's wrong or right necessarily. I mean, I believe in the complete separation of church and state, but there are various churches that exercise vast amounts of political power, not just here in the United States, but around the world. And since surveillance equipment is so readily obtainable It's not difficult to spy on a person, especially for a government which essentially has unlimited resources to obtain surveillance and espionage equipment. All right? If you're a democratic society, if you're a constitutional republic, obviously there has to be some sort of a justification for this. But even then, the justification is thin. The justification is thin when you live in a free market capitalist society, a constitutional republic, or a democratic society. You see. So when you look at the Cheka, for example, which is the progenitor, or we'll call it the spiritual progenitor to the NKVD, you'll see just where the NKVD got its blueprint, right? Counterintelligence, fierce loyalty, human intelligence, which is the use of covert operatives, technical intelligence, meaning espionage using technology. The members of this secret police were known as Chekists, and they did whatever they were told, and there was no limit to what they would do if told. The word Soviet means council, assembly, or advice. And that was the sort of the long and short of why it was called the Soviet Union. It was just simply called a council of unions, in so many words. Let's see. I oftentimes refer to clandestine gangstalking as an extrajudicial espionage and disruption protocol. Okay? The Troikai, the Dvoikai, or other extrajudicial authorities appointed by Stalin and his team operated with total impunity. I mean, torture, mass arrests, crimes against humanity, false imprisonment, executions. These various subunits of the Soviet secret police were able to carry these things out with impunity.